people believe that there's a risk to it is the moment they will never talk. And what I learned quickly, in fact, it was like the moment you disclose, it's 100% better. And then you get to get better all the time. And so the moment I disclosed, I realized that every fear, every concern, everything I worried about was never going to be true. I was not going to lose my business. I was not going to lose my friends. I was not going to lose the relationships that matter. And in fact, I gained relationships that were more important than I ever thought possible from people I just met. And so the concern I had professionally was about the smallest and weakest concern you could possibly have. and what I learned is there was only benefit. Doesn't mean that everyone's going to understand. And so when you ask, who did I talk to? Well, I was desperate, right? I was thinking that I should die. My family should be better off without me. And I desperately need some help because I can't believe I'm in this dark, dark hole. And so I reached out to a personal friend I'd known for 15 years. And she was a PhD psychologist. And I said, Diana, I need your help. And she was there for me. And because we have a good personal relationship, there was love, empathy, and tough. And her tough was hard.
That's
tough. Her tough was an ass kick, you know, and it got me going. And then the next step was disclosure to my wife that I needed to deal with this publicly in my own personal realm. And so that meant I had to share with my mom, who I never ever told. I had to share with my kids because it's critically important. We needed the family to rally around it. I had to share with my father and my sister. And I had to seek the help of a professional who did EMDR to help me with the anxiety and the stress and work through the psychotherapy part. And so those were my first people. And outside of that, I never would have had to go to anyone else.
That's a blessing. I mean, it really is a blessing. I know finding the right person is always the hardest part, right? And so I'm excited to hear that you did find that right person. I joke that I probably went through 7 or 8 therapists before I found someone who could very much understand my perspective, right? And mine being unique in that being a woman in technology, being a woman in technology at the time, working in a field that was not very female friendly. And so it took a long time for me to kind of get that right fit. But once I did, that person is, my therapist is very vital to my continued journey. And so to that point, I want to talk about continuing a journey. A lot of gentlemen that I meet believe that that there's really no stop, right? They're just like, if I go, then I'll have to go forever. If I take medicine, I'll have to take medicine forever. And because I don't want to do that forever, I'm not going to do it at all. I'm going to choose to just figure it out on my own. So talk to us a little bit about what the journey of finding your unlimited worth looks like. And is there a stopping point, or is this something that we can hopefully grow with forever?
Big question. The first is myths and misperceptions, right? And that is treatment will go on forever. Or what a lot of men in successful positions who keep that secret guarded, the last thing they want to do is go to the confessional, right? You hear of addiction programs, and the addiction programs is you have to reveal all your sins. Well, you don't. You don't have to tell everything you've ever done wrong in your life. You have to deal with your core secret. And the core secret is the trauma that protected you as a further threats and violence and abuse so that you could survive. That's at the element. That's the fundamental element of what you need to deal with. But, whether you stole gun or did someone wrong throughout your life isn't relevant. You have to get to the core element of what it is. So that's key. The misperception, of course, is going to be painful. I'm going to be crying the whole time, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to be defined by it. I'm going to be that guy, that guy. Well, here's the reality check. By keeping the secret, I was defined by my trauma every single day of my life. Every time I heard abuse, time I heard of gymnastics, the gymnastics scandal, the movies, everybody else, every time that came up, I was like, that's me too. Right. That was my story. And every time I got into conflict verbally with people in business, which occasionally you do, it was, you don't understand me. I've got a secret. I want to blah, but I'm not going to. I can't tell you. I can't reveal. So no matter what, every day you're defined by it. So coming clean to the other side is you let it go, and then you start working on you, because we are hardwired to protect the child. And when we are hardwired, we can rewire. And once we become aware of how we were hardwired to protect that child, how it affects our personal and professional relationships, we can begin to undo that work and redo it, which means disconnecting the patterns that we develop because of the trauma from the emotions that mess us up all the time, right? I call them normal, and I forget, like, we live in dysfunction. So, everybody has a normal that's their own thing, but let's just say a normal experience with emotions from people who are healed or haven't had the trauma, a major trauma in childhood, our happiness happens, right? And sadness happens too. And you kind of brush it off and move on. It's about, and that whole premise, and I've heard it a lot, like, it's about attitude. You bet.
Absolutely.
But when it's deeply connected to an underlying trauma, it's not just happening, it sticks. And once you disconnect that, it just happens again. And you reset what your hardwired patterns are for, what your instincts are, and you gain control because you become aware.
Yeah, no, that's great. I love that. That visibility of understanding we've got to disconnect from that child, and EMDR is absolutely a great tool for that. And I definitely want to dodge and delve into that quickly. Just a heads up, just so you know, the LinkedIn live part isn't working. We are live still on YouTube. And so I am a believer that everything happens for a reason. So the people that are here are supposed to be here. The people that'll have to catch it on replay will catch it on replay. But I'm still trying to communicate to people on LinkedIn. So we're pushing them to YouTube. So know that that's why I'm looking off into the distance. I'm actually looking at the monitor. I'm not just completely ignoring you. So I want to talk a little bit more about kind of that reframing and the importance of, in a moment of stress. And I've got a couple of friends on, my friend Aaron and Chris have both heard me talk about the importance of the 7 seconds of silence, right? So when we are in a moment that we've been triggered, or something may remind us, that trauma trigger, that trauma response, taking the 7 seconds of silence for me gives me the opportunity to go, am I this upset about what's happening right now? Or am I this upset about this that reminds me of my past trauma, right? Yeah. And so that allows me to do that disconnection that you're talking about, right? To be able to go, okay, hold on, that's my inner child showing up. That is my trauma. That's the little version of me, 7, 8, 9 years old. And I'm responding as a 50-year-old. And so I've got to stop, take my couple moments and go, actually, that's the trauma version of me that responded. And sometimes I've got to apologize, right?
Yeah.
So how is that different? Because, women, we talk all the time as a parent, because that's what I'm doing. So how is that different from a male point of view? Like, does it make it more difficult as a gentleman to say, hey, I'm struggling today in this moment, versus going out to see a therapist, which we know we can do. But in that moment, when something is really taking you to that next level of like stress, how do you address that without then the fear of losing respect of those around you or the judgment? How have you navigated that?
The first thing you brought up was the incongruency. The things that we learn, the patterns and the self-protection as a child who experienced trauma of any sort, the patterns that we use to survive are often incongruent in our professional and personal lives as adults, right? We're not trying to survive. We're not making it through the jungle or the savannah or in war. Like, we're not doing that. We're really navigating social society. And so that's one element of a lack of control we have, because we start to feel anxious or odd or unusual in circumstances that are typical, right? Typical. Men don't allow men. We've grown up, we've lived in a society and a culture that is built off a patriarchal model. And, let me just point out, I am squarely in the middle. Okay. The hard leaning, masculine, hyper masculine, beat drums in the woods. You're not getting that from me. You're also not getting the hyper feminist and, emasculine men. What we're getting is men who deserve space from other men. We've been in a culture. I worked in finance, working in the brokerage industry for 20 years, a male dominated industry. No one talks about it, but of course, 3 addicts, a couple people whose marriage broke up, and a guy who almost destroyed the firm because they did something stupid. And you go, well, I wonder how that's happening. Right. It's happening because there's troubled. I have this saying, troubled men make trouble. Unresolved trauma in places where men aren't allowed to speak about their trauma or feel comfortable that if they're dealing with it, they're welcome back into the fold. That's the problem. That's the bigger problem. That's why men are disproportionately more violent. That's why we kill ourselves more often. And that's why we hurt women. The real key incidents around that is the evidence is overwhelming. And the reason is we can't deal with being human when we're trying to be men. Right. And men, we're rewarded for making money, dominating, being violent, aggressive, right? We're rewarded for being dominant over females. Our society has created a culture that allows us only support for that. And if we're not feeling right, we're not feeling strong, we're feeling vulnerable, you're pushed aside because we compete to get ahead of the next guy. Yeah. When we change that, when we create space and an environment in leadership, because it really requires our leaders to embrace the premise that we give space where it's needed. And I don't have to know about every guy on my board of directors or executive. I don't need to know their secret. Right. But here's what's amazing. The moment you create space and make it safe to have that conversation without retribution, the fear of loss, fear of losing your job or your position or your rank, men share. Men share overwhelmingly.
I love that. But how do you avoid that? Like I got a bunch of questions for that. I was like, but the first one, we talked about culture, right? And so I know you and I have been messaging back and forth this week. But one of the stories that I actually sent to my producer for my TV show was around kind of how certain cultures refuse to have the conversations about mental health when it comes to men. And the story that I shared was about a young lady whose culture, faith, did not allow for divorce, right? And she at some point realized that her new husband was struggling, and when he got angry, he would lash out, back to a lot of the points you made. But culturally, divorce is a sin, and she was not allowed to leave. And the story that was posted, actually, the young man, and they're both in their 20s, killed her and then killed himself. Right. And so I want to make sure that people understand that it's not necessarily just impacting just the men. Right. Because men as fathers, men as champions, men as leaders in corporate America or whatever or in industry we're working in, if our gentlemen don't have a place to let out all of this tension and this frustration, then the homes sometimes are impacted and the families are impacted. But culturally speaking, it doesn't really matter where you're from. Men are never given that opportunity to share how they typically are feeling emotionally. It doesn't really matter, right? I mean, culturally, you can kind of come from most backgrounds and find stories like yours, like, hey, there are some things that happened, but I have nobody to talk about, right? But what's your perspective?
Oh, you're right. Culturally, I think we look at just Western society. Then we have a certain construct of what it means to be a man and navigate the world as a successful man in sports, entertainment, business, and just life. Mm-hmm. And then you add on childhood unresolved trauma or a lifetime of traumas. I mean, we're talking, look at a veteran who went over at age 20 and saw things, they lived through stuff too.
Absolutely.
You put unresolved trauma in there in a culture that doesn't reward that disclosure. And then you layer on religious or other ethnically cultural forces that might have beliefs about how women fit in a patriarchal society, whether their role is valued or whether it is, segregated or however it's perceived. And then now you compound it by giving license to behave in the worst possible way. And when one is unsettled and traumatized, they will do irrational things. And that irrationality might not draw the line at physical violence. It may cross it. It may do worse. And we've seen the evidence of that it does happen. And so how do you get there? Well, one of the challenges is, and I'm throwing this back at my wife in a good way, is she's a loving, empathetic woman who knew my challenge from the very minute from the very beginning, when time we spend together, because I thought it was important she know. And women were always safe for me. She knew I came from a loving home. So she was never worried that I didn't come up with good morals and values. So, but she also saw success rising all the time with me. And she thought, this guy doesn't have any problems. He's clearly dealt with it. And what she didn't understand is I never dealt with it, clearly, because I wouldn't have had the crisis I did. And it just took a lot longer for it to well up and become a problem. The challenge that we face is our loved ones, and our society doesn't open up the door for men to have a conversation about this and to bring their attention to anything that they feel that they're repeating and being limited by could very well be tracked back to their trauma.
Right.
And in a normal, as a matter of fact, conversation, when nothing's going wrong, that's when we need to work on it. If I'm going through my days and I think, boy, I would like an advantage physically because I want to participate with my buddies on the weekend at their whatever, biking or whatever people do, and I want to be, or golf better, then I'm going to hit the gym a bit and I'm going to do some stretching and I'm going to do some things that help improve my physicality so I can work better and enjoy my pastimes better.
Right.
We don't take that approach with mental health. We say this is a box that troubled people go into and then they get fixed, or they don't, and it is ongoing. Mm-hmm. The reality is the treatment is no different. The physical injury with the brain, we have this weird thing that we think psychology is all about some kind of esoteric, mystical thing. It's not. Our brains, we're biological machines, right? And we have physiological functions that our brains send chemicals and impulses by. It's not mystical, it's chemical and neurological. And so when we consider that if that's the case, then we can improve it, right? So why wouldn't we improve? No different than go for a walk or a run or hit the gym to improve our physicality. Why wouldn't we do that work when we're okay?
Right.
And a culture, an attitude, a societal view that mental health is really mental wellness. And if we approach it in that way, we'll work on it all the time. And Absolutely. Then we begin to connect. We start to go, oh, you mean what I'm doing today is because of what happened when I was 11? You know, that child that was protecting themselves and now they don't trust good men? And because the pillar of the community abused them, like that's my problem. I might have been able to figure that out for myself.
Yeah.
You know, maybe I didn't need therapy. Maybe I could have navigated the waters if I constantly was attending to my mental wellness.
That's great. And I love that you made that example. And then Chris, I see you have a comment. I'm going to read it in just a moment. But I think even more importantly, like the work that we're doing, and Mike, you and I had a conversation about what mental wealth is. So I, for example, never want my children to be hungry. Like I never want my children to not have, right? So I taught them early about financial wealth, right? Mm-hmm. I talked to them about saving, and I talked to them about withdrawal and not spending more than what you get. And so our concept of mental wealth is exactly what you just explained, right? Is talking about it as early as possible to everyone. So my daughter, not so much because I didn't know, I was young. I hadn't dealt with my own trauma yet. And my daughter's now 34, but my 14-year-old, like we started having conversations very early on, like, tell me what you're feeling. And his dad, his dad's like, no, you don't have to talk about feelings. We're men. Men don't talk about feelings. Right. And I'm like, well, if we don't talk about feelings, then we don't teach how to respond to them. And so how early do you think is too early to have a conversation about proactive mental wealth, right? How soon is too soon?
So my focus is making the next generation of boys better men, right?
Yes.
And in order to do that, my personal approach is work with the leaders in our world. Yes. And by working with leaders, we create a culture that removes some of the patriarchal structures, that allows for space, etc. That's where I focus my time and energy. When I'm also working with an organization out of Canada called the Stigma Free Society. And that was an organization that was developed to highlight mental health and mental wellness conversations. And part of the outreach that we do is we get to speak with kids. And we're speaking with grade 4 all the way through grade 12. In segments. So grade 4 to 7, 8 to 12. And so if you think about the age, what we're saying is the conversation we're having is it's okay not to feel okay. You can be sad sometimes. And when that sadness, anger, fear, or odd feeling persists, then it's time to have a conversation with someone you love and trust, and an authority, a teacher or a doctor. That's the type of conversations we're having. We're saying that by acknowledging your own situation, you become aware of what others may be going through. Yeah. And if we can build a community of children who give people the space because they understand that they might have that challenge too, right, then we create the ability to reduce the stigma. I noticed in the comments there were some comments around stigma and being punished for being revealing. And the reality is, when you reveal from the close-knit circle outward and stop wherever you choose, you're not punished. You are embraced by those who love you. Sometimes home's not the place. Like, let's be true. Sometimes that's where it's all coming from. So those aren't the people, but people who are professionals and who are in the love and trust part of your life, they will care about you more and they will provide for you. Right. You can't expect that healing is going to happen on the stage in front of millions. That's not where it happens. It happens with work that you do with yourself and a professional. Every day. Right. Every day. Mm-hmm. And the ongoing is, I decided to start having check-ins with my psychologist, because I was wondering how I'm feeling really good.
You're like, what is this feeling? I don't know.
Am I off the other end? Like, did I go somewhere else? Like, should I feel good? Sure. And it was about bringing that back. And then I was like, okay, I'm feeling great about this. I've got strategies to deal with that, but I can't get out of this gloom. What's going on here? Mm-hmm. And then, how do I deal with it? And so it's ongoing, but not the perception that it has to be ongoing in the way that you're stuck in this. I've got to always talk about my feelings every month. We're not Tony Soprano sneaking around the corner and having to meet his therapist all the time. Like, it doesn't happen like that.
Yeah, no, that's a great response. And I agree wholeheartedly. I think if, our goal is to have this paradigm shift to mental wealth so that people want to talk about it, right? So people can talk about it when the times are good. So it's just kind of like healthy eating, like on my show, John Sally was a guest, and he's a vegan, like strict vegan. Like, he is like,
I heard it. You were dancing around a few conversational items.
He's just like, if you just stop putting that stuff in your body,
don't invite me to the steakhouse.
But the chef there did a great job. But still at the end of
Beautiful.
the day, like we need to understand that mental wealth, mental wellness, right, is something that we work on even in the good times, right? And so the way we talk about it, again, when I woke up this morning, I felt like $1 million, right? So that
Oh,
means
yeah.
I start my day off with $1 million. Will some bad things happen? Absolutely. Right? That will be a withdrawal from my account. It's up to me to decide, how do I then find another deposit? What is going to be a deposit to replace that expenditure, right?
Oh,
That
yeah.
you refer to it as. And if I practice that, that's something I have to do every single day, not just on the bad days. Because if I only do it on the bad days, it's not going to work. It's got to be like muscle memory. Like, okay, it's a new morning. I woke up. I'll tell you that my morning this morning, though, I woke up feeling like $1 million. I woke up to some pretty not so good news. So
Hmm.
I was on news channels a couple of weeks ago about the launch of 988, which is this global number that you
Yeah.
could dial and get mental health support. This morning my producer called and was like, hey, I've got some interviews for you to do, because with 98 people are calling 988, and instead of them being connected with the mental health advisor, they're going to jail. They're being
Oh,
forcibly institutionalized. They are like, it's pretty bad, right?
right.
And so this morning, since I don't know what time this morning, have been on the phone saying, okay, this is new. And we knew that something was going to happen because we knew we didn't have enough people, like Chris Loriano, who's on the call with us today, works in this space as well, making sure that
Hmm.
people learn how to transition after a traumatic event or after therapy and intensive care. But now people are going to be even that much more afraid to use this service if we know the punitive like outcomes. So it's like we're trying to make changes. I'm excited to see how much we've grown as a planet since COVID. But the challenge is there are some real life examples that are happening as recently as today, where people are like, okay, Mike, I hear you. You're telling me to find a person and to reach out. And to Chris's point earlier, there are still those punitive kind of actions that happen, right? That's that you can't come back from. If it happens to you at your company, it's quite possible that you could lose your job. And sadly, if you lose your job because of a mental break, right? Because my brain just could not take anymore, then now you become less hireable or there is a fear that you will become less hireable, especially like we said, for those leaders. Now we've worked our way up to get to this point. But now, because again, men, I know I've interviewed hundreds of men, thousands of maybe, and sometimes the interview is like, hey, what's up? I can do this job. I got it. Right. And they're just like, oh, I like your confidence. I like your bravado or whatever. But that same person, when hit with that same gentleman, when hit with a very stressful work environment, they kind of fall apart. Like that confidence is no longer there. And who's there to talk to them in that space? Right. Are they suicidal? Maybe not so yet. But it becomes one of those things that, like, I tried at this and I didn't succeed. Where do I go? How do I find someone? And like you mentioned, some of us don't have family to talk to, right?
Hmm.
Some of us don't have, the partner or the spouse or the family, that close knit circle. So, what's your suggestion or advice if you don't have that close knit circle that you can start from you and then slowly branch out before you? Like, what's your advice for that?
Yeah, I think it's really important to clarify as physical trauma, as you would clarify with physical trauma. So we talked about EMDR as a treatment.
Mhm.
I equate it to ice,
Okay.
and so if I blew out my knee and I have an ACL injury that's really swelling up, I would apply ice, because there's no way I can treat it, assess it, look at it, and do things that are necessary to rehab if I don't bring the pain and inflammation down. And so EMDR is a lot like that. So if I were to take that a step further, EMDR removes the anxiety and the stress and the emotional charge out of things so we can start thinking rationally, right? If we think a little more like triage, a hospital will, if it bleeds, it leads. You get first attention. If your life is in crisis, if you have a heart attack, if you have heart issues, you would say my heart's hurting, you suddenly get care. What we need to do generally is educate the population on what the ABCs of mental health crisis is. right? Because airway, breathing, circulation is our physical. We know first aid. What about mental first aid? Well, what is mental first aid? Well, simply put, are you thinking of killing yourself today? Have you thought of it in the last little while? Is this a suicide moment? Have you done harm to yourself or others? Right? That's where some of the challenge becomes, because, there isn't mental health crises happen to you, and they might have happened to others. Well, there is a differentiation. The intention to do harm versus having done harm really segments out where we go in the system, doesn't it? Yes. And we got to deal with people who've done harm to others, right? Even though they need help, we need to move them along that path. The challenge is, are you going to kill yourself today or hurt others? Okay, well, I think that's a good triage. Are you feeling that you can't change the current patterns in your life? Right. Okay, well, now we can take some time. So what do I need? And you can go into a system. In Canada, there's some great Canadian Center for Suicide Prevention has an incredible resource of a step-by-step process to make those determinations. And if they decide, well, this might be my problem today, they immediately go into a hotline. And so it's a hotline of either 911, right? Because I'm in a crisis moment where I'm going to hurt somebody, hurt myself, or I need to talk to someone. Right. On the other side, it's, do we need financial? Do we need addiction? Do we need physical abuse? Are you being abused? What is the circumstance of your trauma right now and causing you the mental crisis? And then there's a direction. And so being able to triage people will help keep people out of jail, essentially, right? The mental ill person who no one can constrain, who's having a major crisis, will go to jail before they get mental help, but they don't need to go to jail. And so how do we make that differentiation? Sherry, I'm lucky, I'm fortunate to have great and wonderful, loving people around me. I understand that not everyone has a person, but there are some simple determinations we can make for ourselves. Are we really considering ending it today? Then it's a crisis that goes somewhere else. Mm-hmm. If we're not, what are the criteria to find a professional that can help me? Right? What do I need to know? Well, if you have childhood trauma, well, you need an EMDR specialist, you need a psychotherapist, you might need psychiatry because you may have an imbalance of chemicals in your body, right? And so if we educate the population on how to triage themselves, I know that if I cut my finger, I can look at it and go, that's a paper cut, I'm not going to the emergency. Or, my goodness, I can see my bone, then you're going to the emergency, right? So now I've made a decision. We need to understand how to do that about our mental health.
I agree. And Chris's point was saying this as well. He said it's a two-pronged approach, right? And Chris, you're more than welcome to take yourself off mute and join the conversation, as Aaron and Thomas, you as well. But Chris, since this is your space, right? Let's give Mike a moment to breathe and grab some water if he needs to. So Chris, tell us a little bit about some of the stresses that you see. Tell us first, introduce yourself, and then let us know the space that you work in, and tell me kind of your perspective about what you see specifically when it comes to men and their mental wealth.
Thank you so much, Sherry. I know I've been posting a lot of comments earlier, so I don't want to overwhelm people, but so my name is Chris Loriano. I work for an agency in Boston, Massachusetts called Baco Human Services. And I direct a training and internship program where I actually train for 4 weeks people with lived experience receiving mental health and public health services when it comes to, training them to either eventually do clinical work themselves or to do work in a field that's called the peer specialist, which is based off of peer support, which is something I've done for many years. And it's a person who has lived experience with mental health, substance use, trauma, and a lot of the stuff that we're talking about in this call. So I've been doing that for a couple years, and I myself as a man have lived experience with this too. And I think, Mike, I really appreciate what you had talked about when it comes to, a lot of these stigmas that often men go through when it comes to being vulnerable and sharing your feelings and emotions, because I grew up from a Portuguese family, and I still live with them for different reasons. And growing up, I was often discouraged as well from even my own family to disclosing emotions and especially as someone who was autistic and someone who has thought about suicide as well growing up at a young age, and dealing with those feelings, a lot of times I just I remember feeling not comfortable at all to disclose those things for many reasons. One being that my family didn't really open those conversations up, and I was kind of told to man up and that I was being overly sensitive and all of these other things. And it wasn't until much later as an adult that I was able to get into peer support and to be able to find a space to talk with others. And by the way, peer specialists are not clinical providers, so they're not therapists or counselors, but they are people who will, instead of looking at conversations or looking at people from a clinical lens, so instead of like the mental health first aid stuff that we were just referencing, we really are just having conversations about what we're going through. And like, if I was having a conversation with Sherry about my thoughts of suicide, instead of her kind of looking at me and giving me assessment questions, what she would do, if she had gone through this herself, she would say, wow, Chris, I definitely hear you. I'm really sorry you've been going through that. I definitely know what it's like because I've gone through it myself. And then each person shares a piece of their lived experience without any specific agenda, without leading towards any goals or solutions. Now, unless that's what both people want in the relationship, but just having a conversation and having that open, welcoming space. And there's more of that that's coming out in the country, thankfully. But and I'll say for myself as a man, that's what really helped me the most over the past several years when I've dealt with, my mental health stuff and just emotionally. And for me, I think what's really helped me the most, aside from having therapy, which I recently graduated from, is more so myself being able to have people that I can speak to about, the issues that I'm kind of going through without being pathologized against, without, worrying about something terrible happening to me, without me being forced to take medications or to have my rights being taken away, which working in a human services environment, everyone that I have, well, most people that I've supported, whether they live in group home environments or receive longer term services, a lot of times that's what they often experience.
Right. Yeah,
So
and
there's
that's
a lot.
terrifying.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Chris. And it's terrifying, right? We've got to understand that, like, as much as we've got folks like you, Chris, and you, Mike, and myself working in this space to make these conversations more comfortable, again, the reality is, if your family doesn't support it, if you're not surrounded by people who understand the importance of managing your mental health, then they will do what they know to do, which is, call 911 or, forcibly have you admitted into, a psych ward, which then becomes another traumatic event, right? Which becomes another form of trauma that you find even harder to work your way through.
If I may, Chris, I really want to thank you. Thank you for sharing your journey, your experience, and congratulations on navigating the water, but also congratulations for making an impact in people's lives. I really appreciate that. And then I'm going to push back.
Sure.
So a little pushback. The pushback only is on the suicide part. There's something, Living Work Suicide Prevention, if anyone wants to look at it. It's an exceptional tool, an exceptional deep resource. And the moment someone suggests there's a suicidal ideation, the conversation should and must shift. And there's plenty of evidence-based studies that support navigating right to that moment. Telling people that it's just fine, that I've been there too, that's a great first step. But when a person starts to share that this is something that's literally going on with their brain, you must shift to an emergency situation because that person is in danger. Let's separate that. Again, there's a triage moment. That doesn't mean that there are other challenges. I didn't have a mental illness before I had a crisis. My mental illness was the depression I had for 10 days, and it might have been 3 because I might have killed myself and that might have been it. No one would ever have known. The challenge, of course, is then what was the cause of the crisis? And how do we pull ourselves out of it. So is it an ongoing mental illness? Is it a mental trauma that now is, traumatized? A person's traumatized because of the pressures that they feel. So what we're doing is buying the moment. There's no rush other than to disclose to get proper treatment. And proper treatment comes from understanding, what do I need and how can I find a resource that helps me understand the criteria? Like if I went and got EMDR, psychotherapy, talk therapy from a 25-year-old girl woman who came out of school, right? And I don't mean to demean that age. I have a 21-year-old daughter. That's why. So I think of her as my little girl still. I'm aging myself.
So you're fine.
That wouldn't have been the right person for me. I needed a middle-aged father who had a male experience and who was a really good man, because that was a real critical piece of my healing puzzle. The woman I reached out to, I trust more than anything, was not the right expert to deliver what I needed. And we agreed on that. And I found someone who was. And so what we need to do is buy the moment in time to then source the right resources. And you're right, they're not necessarily in our community and they're not available to everyone. I have not met my therapist. We've done all online.
Okay.
Right. We have that ability now, and your resource no longer who are the people within 2 miles of me.
Right. That's a great response. And thank you for sharing that, Chris, also.
Yeah, thank you.
So, sorry, I don't mean to, I wanted to just kind of say, Mike, just thank you for sharing that perspective, because I really do think that what you had to share was really meaningful. And I guess one of the things that I'm kind of hoping that we kind of get to, and I know this is kind of a side point, but I think what I've shared earlier is just one perspective, right?
Yeah.
Different things can work for different people. And I think one of the things that when I train people with lived experience to kind of really think about is like when we support each other, and I think we kind of all agree with this, is that, kind of letting, people and, generally speaking, decide like what resource is going to be best helpful for them. And I think that that's, really important in terms of creating societal and systemic change. And I think that alludes to the two-pronged approach comment that Sherry brought up. So I want to thank you actually for sharing that perspective, because different things work for different people. And I think multiple things can be true at once. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, that's great. And understand, I'm a Canadian, taking a Canadian and maybe Euro. Look at this. Our overwhelming sense, I like to say common sense, but just our overwhelming sense is that we're willing to give up some rights to better ourselves and better our communities. And our staunch protection of our rights is willing to be compromised in moments where those things matter more. We don't come from a culture that don't take my rights away, even if I have a right to do whatever is killing me today. Like we don't live in that. And so I think that's a reasonable balance, and it's different perspective. And I respect that that's a different cultural upbringing as well. And, for my friends south of the border.
No, that's a good call out, actually. So thanks for that. Thanks for that response. And thanks for that question, Chris. So Aaron, I would love to hear your feedback. So Aaron is one of my fabulous C-suite network family members. And Aaron has this great show, a great stroke TV show that he runs, and he's an amazing catalyst for change in our community. And so Aaron, I know you had your hand raised, but I was already going to call on you because I had a question for you. So really quickly, I know we only have 5 minutes left. We don't, but so really quickly, tell us a little bit about how the physical impact of you having a stroke and the impact on your mental wealth and your mental well-being. How are you managing that? I know through your TV show by helping other survivors, but how did your stroke then impact your mental wealth, and what are you doing to kind of keep yourself on a good journey?
Thank you, Sherry. I appreciate that. I'm going to talk to you not necessarily the stroke survivor I am. I'm going to throw you a little curve, because I've been listening to all you talk about it. I've had experience my own trauma, and I don't have time to get into that. But I will tell you what I've heard, the root core of all the activity, everything is spoken. Mike, you confirm this, is fear. Fear of being exposed, fear of telling someone how you feel. Fear stops you. I personally, in my journey, I'm a stroke survivor. It's not just about stroke. It's about me navigating this journey of life that I'm experiencing. And I'm telling you, right now, I'm dealing with fear. And what I found with fear is that fear will stop you. I'm suicidal. I've been suicidal many times, but fear stops you from telling someone. Here, when we do a show, one time, I'll talk about fear together, because I think you can boil all these conversations down. If we can address the fear, get over that fear. I'm going to tell you what I'm doing. Run for it. Don't run from it, run towards it. Fear is your Goliath.
Yes,
In your life.
absolutely.
And I'm telling you that I am currently, right now, I'm not getting into it because I don't have time, but I'm running towards my fear for the first time in my life in 58 years, and it feels awesome. I don't need to talk to anybody else. I'm just saying that run towards your fear, because your destiny, your freedom is on the other side of that fear.
I love
Yeah, I
that
get that.
so much, Aaron. You are such my hero. He's such an amazing human. Thank you so much. That's right. So that's our goal. That's our homework from everybody that's on this call. We're going to run towards our fear, whatever it is. And to add to what Aaron said, and Mashira, I saw that you had your hand up, and I'm going to call you in 1 second. But the good thing about fear, like all of the wonderful things that have ever happened to us in our lives, at one point we were terrified of it, right? Whether it was dating, finding our person, whatever, like going to school, all of those things terrified us at one point and then made us better humans. So I agree wholeheartedly with Aaron's statement. Let's run towards our fear, and then let's challenge it, because sometimes the fear is just made up in our head, or it's something that's assumed, or something that we've heard. And so checking and going, is it really going to cost me my job if I tell someone I need a mental health day? Really? Like, let me just verify the facts. So great point, Aaron. Mashira, you had a question. And so, so Mashira's going to message her question because she can't, or can you? Yeah, she can
Now,
talk. So
Aaron,
yes,
just
Tom,
as
you have
that
something?
question, as that question's coming up, Aaron, I was afraid, I was fearful that I was letting my family down, that I'd be revealed as a failure, that I wasn't good enough, that I wasn't worthy enough. I was afraid of failing at killing myself. Like everything was fear. But the biggest fear was I had to deal with the thing that I didn't understand, that was troubling me. And I had to reveal that I was violated as a kid. And that fear became immediately reduced to nothing the moment I disclosed.
Right.
In fact, I was, and it's rare, it happens, but it's rare where the moment you disclose, people are like, you're now a pariah, you're out. What they do is they say, I can't believe that happened. I'm so sorry for you. I love you more.
Yeah.
There's a great study. There was a great study that a college study where they were asking people, you're going to walk out with a white t-shirt and a black stain, a stain of like chocolate on your shirt, right? And you're going to walk out in public, and you want help. You want people to tell you, and no one tells them. Right. And then all the people who didn't say anything were interviewed, and they said, well, if you had something glaring happening with you, would you want other people to help you? And they said, overwhelmingly, everybody said, yes, we would want that help. Yet people were afraid to break that conversational barrier and help others. So it's a two-way street. The person who's struggling inside is afraid, and people are just as afraid to lend a hand. Anyways.
I love that. Thank you. It's 2:00. I want to get to your question, Thomas. I understand if anyone has to go, but Mike, are you good for a few more minutes?
You bet.
Okay. All right, Thomas.
This is overtime now.
Yeah. So
For overtime, I got to pay you extra. Okay, got it.
Yeah.
No, I mean, overtime fun.
Yeah. I just want to. So, Mike, thanks for sharing, man. I'm actually good friends with Mike as well. I'm also part of the C-Suite Network, Sherry. So Mike, thanks for sharing everything you shared today. Will the majority of this information be covered in your book?
This information will be more than covered in the book. The book talks about my journey and puts stories and meaning to the right? What it meant to live 40 years with all the emotions that were connected to the underlying patterns that my brain put in motion for me after trauma. And then coming out of healing, what emotions reside without any connection, and how incredible that journey is. So that book, that's what my book talks about.
Understood. And what's the title of the book?
Unlimited Worth.
There you go. There you go. And
I have to pay you now too, Thomas. Also, thank you.
no worries.
Right.
I also run a podcast as well. So I mean, I really appreciate this conversation. Originally, I was gonna come here for 30 minutes and leave, but I had to stay because myself personally, I went through a traumatic situation. I went through a civil war, and Mike knows about this very well, also Aaron. And I went through a lot of trauma, and I was able to overcome because I had a good family, good people surrounding me. So what you mentioned in terms of having the right people, so critical. So critical. So kudos to you for everything you shared today. And thanks for having this podcast.
Awesome. Thank you, Thomas. That's awesome. And then Michelle had a question too. She made a hashtag for you, which I love it. Run for Aaron. She created a hashtag for you, Aaron. Hashtag run towards your fear. So we'll have to plop that in C-Suite Celebrate some way tomorrow. But Michelle's question is, what practical steps would you all say we can take to get past the fear? And can I jump in first, and then Mike, you, and then whoever else? I will say that one of the most amazing videos on the interwebs right now, to me, there was a video of Will Smith from years and years ago, and he talked about his first experience jumping out of a plane, right? And it is, I mean, it's just so well articulated because he's like, some guys are like, hey, we're gonna go jump out of a plane tomorrow. You should join us. It's gonna be great. And he's like, yeah, I can do it. And he said he worried about it the whole night before. He worried about it that morning. He barely slept. He was terrified. This fear almost kept him from doing it. He's like, literally until the time they were like strapping me in, I was still terrified. He said, but when I jumped out of that plane, it was complete and total silence and a peace that I had never experienced before, nor would I have ever been able to experience had I not gotten over my fear. Had I let my fear take over, then I would never have experienced the beauty and the quiet and the silence and the freedom that existed when I just let myself go. And so I love that. And I love using that story in my analogies because it's like, if you can push through your fear, be so excited about what's on the other side of it. Dr. Phil Agrios talks about our self-saboteur and how our self-saboteur is there to protect us initially, but we've got to learn to make sure that our self-saboteur does not eliminate the opportunity for whatever's on the other side of that fear, right? And so if something scares you, it's probably really good for you, right? Yeah. It's probably something you need to go through and figure out what's to exist on the other side. What do you think, Mike?
Mashera, is it Mashera? Mashera. I reached out to someone to help me at the darkest time. And like I said, she loves me. She was empathetic, but she was tough. And her tough was a really what's next? And so what? And what then? What is the worst? When we navigate our fears, we have to consider what's the worst thing can happen. And if you do, then what? And if you don't, then what? And the challenge with that is it puts you in, I don't want to get out of bed. Well, what happens then? Well, then I don't, what's your biggest problem? Well, money. I need to get money. I can't help my family. Okay. What happens then? I can't get help. What happens then? Right. But what if you got out of bed? Well, then I'd just be miserable and up. But what happens if you did this? And what happened? So a journey of what then was an excellent way to break down the fear and turn it into nothing and make it that step that you need to take that reveal, to make that reveal to wherever it's important to you. And once you do that, once you're out there, you're out there. So there's not much, you can't walk that back. Like the most deep, dark core secret, once you get that out there into the right hands, you got nothing else to lose.
Right.
Right.
Only to
And
win.
we
Only to gain.
often, and we're living in a regular society where we're not at risk of, being killed on this. We're not living in a military zone, and we're not living, every decision isn't life or death with us, right? We're in a society where what next meant you might just get to go to Starbucks today and have a coffee, right? Instead of staying in your house and hiding in your bed. But that just might be the next what next.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. Good response. I love it that we've gone over, because that means we're having a great conversation. I always want to be respectful of everyone's time, but as long as we've got Mike, we've got questions until you throw in the white flag. Thomas, you have another question? Go for it.
Yeah, it's more of a statement. I just want to share this just to add to the conversation. So I heard this so earlier today, I heard Dr. Lipkin mention, because I know fear and worrying are two disempowering things, right? So he mentioned worrying is praying for something you don't want, right? So I thought that was quite profound right there. We
Say
worry
that
about
again,
something.
Thomas. Say that again.
Worrying is praying for things you do not want.
Okay.
So this also comes to mindset, because we tend to overthink things, and we tend to put ourselves in our own box. We tend to kind of limit ourselves through these self-limiting beliefs. So the more we work on our mindset as well, the better we could step outside of that box and outside of that uncomfortable zones.
Agreed. I love it. Awesome. Well, it's been an amazing conversation. I want you, Mike, to take us out by telling us about the book. Tell us when we can get it, where we can buy it, how we can find you, how we connect with you. This was an amazing conversation. I'm not sure what happened with LinkedIn. LinkedIn decided they did not want to play with Restream today. But what we did not do is give up, because that's not what we do. We're not giving up. We understand we've got unlimited worth. And I want to know how we can support you, Mike.
Sherry, here's what people can do. They can tune into my Unlimited Worth podcast. We've got 5 episodes out already. MikeSkrypnek.com. You put a / Unlimited Worth Project, Unlimited Worth Podcast, Unlimited Worth Book. It's all there. The book is coming out. I'm doing pre-orders right now, so people are getting it like 40% cheaper, and I'm going to sign them all and hand deliver them now.
I heard you say hand deliver. So that means
I would love to hand deliver, but I just realized
you have to come to Texas
how many airline flights it's going to take.
All
right. Well, Sherry is going to get one hand delivered. So the pre-orders are now, a couple of weeks from now, it'll finally be published, and we'll be ready to go live on Amazon. I'm going to do it self-published this year. That's where they can find me. And hopefully on every stage possible, because if I'm going to change the lives of boys to become better men than the men today, and change that by affecting 1 million men in the next year who are leaders in the boardroom, in the locker room, and in the green room, then I got to be on stages everywhere to make the biggest and largest reach and impact. So book me, hire me, or listen to me when I show up in your city, because I got something to say.
I love it. And I love that you have this transparency. Thank you so much for gifting us with your time today. It has been such an honor to have your insight and your feedback. And I know that so many
Thank
more
you so
people-
much for having me.
Oh, no worries. It's necessary. And this just means we'll have to try it again on LinkedIn Live, because, I don't give up. I'm not a quitter. So we're going to try this again, and we'll figure out why LinkedIn Live and Restream, but we're live on YouTube. And so for everyone who is watching, thank you for joining. Please do find Mike at MikeSkrypnek.com. And then you can find both of us on LinkedIn. Know that we are here to try to create a paradigm shift when it comes to mental illness to one of mental wealth. And the programs that Mike is offering absolutely aligns with the work that we're doing. So however we can help you from a Phoenix Speaks 2020 Lives Change perspective, please know we're here. If I get an opportunity to get on a stage, I'm going to try to drag you right up there with me. So we're going to figure out, we're going to have to tag team it.
Mike and Sherry show, and I won't tell my wife, who's named Sherry.
That's even better.
We'll go tandem on this.
I love it. We'll do it. All right. Thank you guys for joining us today. Please live and love as hard as you can, and know that there's always someone here waiting to talk to you again tomorrow. So we'll see you soon. Thanks, guys. Have a great rest of the day. Bye. Bye, Chris.